Hey, Driven Autism Dads, it's Kyle Jitzel. It's a little earlier this morning. I'm doing a video. The sun's just coming up. It's a little wet and rainy here, so I had to drop my son off at his work instead of him riding his bike. So today I want to talk about a concept that my dad taught me as a pretty young man, kind of accidentally. But it changed the way that I was able to see. It helped me to understand a better way, let me put it that way, to see and face difficulties as they came up, as I face those things with my kids on the autism spectrum. So I want to kind of set the stage here. I grew up in inner city Dallas in an area called Oak Cliff, where nobody had any money. We were all poor. So I got to experience a lot of things, but one of the things that I did not enjoy is every year during the summer we would take a trip from Dallas down to Beaumont, Texas, which is about a 300-mile trip one way. And Beaumont is kind of a little coastal town on the Gulf Coast. But the interesting thing about it is we had an old station wagon. If you don't know what those are, look them up. Look up 70s station wagons and you'll see. But it had a bench seat in front and a bench seat in the middle, and in the back it had seats that were facing backwards. And I had 3 brothers and 1 sister, of course, my mom and dad. So we were all packed in this station wagon, and we would drive down to Beaumont from Dallas. It was back in the day where the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, even on the interstates. So it was a long, hot trip. We didn't have air conditioners in our station wagon, so it was super hot. It was a super long trip, and every stinking year, I'm not kidding you, every year we would start driving out of Dallas, and we get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 hours out of Dallas, and we would break down, because that's kind of what our car did. And luckily, and I think this was almost planned, is my Uncle Mike, who lived down in Beaumont. We would somehow get to a phone. This is before cell phones. This is probably late 70s. Well, I'm aging myself, aren't I? We would somehow walk to a phone at a gas station, or my dad would, or he'd flag down a truck driver or something, because we'd be on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in Texas in the heat, and call my Uncle Mike, who would then hop in his car. Uncle Mike was a mechanic, which was great. And Uncle Mike would grab his duct tape and baling wire and whatever tools he thought would be necessary. And he would drive up, the 3 hours or 4 hours, whatever it was, to get to where we were at, fix our car, and then follow us down to Beaumont. And while we were there, it seems like they would spend most of their time kind of doing some upgrades on our car. By upgrades, I mean fixing it so it would make it back to Dallas. And I remember after about the 3rd or 4th time of breaking down on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in Texas, I asked my dad, I said, "Dad, why do we keep doing this? I mean, we know we're going to break down, and we're stuck out here for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, just waiting. Why do we keep doing this?" And my dad said something that stuck with me, and it kind of changed the way I viewed challenges. He said, "You know what, Kyle? It's just a simple trip until something goes wrong. Then it's an adventure." And he smiled real big. And at the time, it didn't really stick with me as much as it did as I got older. I remember hearing him say that, but also looking back, I don't really remember what we did in Beaumont once we got there. I don't really remember those trips for that. What I remember is waiting on the side of the road when everything went wrong, and how me and my 2 older brothers, younger brother and younger sister, would just scrounge for something to do. I remember one time, I don't know where we were at, but we were on the side of the road, and it was kind of a wooded area off to the side. My dad said, "Go have some fun, don't get lost." Well, we went kind of hunting around through these woods and found a little pond. We came back, and we had some fishing line and rigged up some sort of fishing gear, and we ended up going fishing and having a big fun time fishing. I don't even think we caught anything, but being together fishing with my brothers and sister while we waited, I remember that in detail. Another time, I remember we were across from a cow farm, and my dad said, did you guys know I can call cows? And we're like, whatever. So my dad goes over to the fence, and I'm not kidding you, the cows were a couple hundred yards away off the road. And my dad walked up to the fence and just started mooing. He had this, it sounded like a cow. And sure enough, their heads lifted, and they started looking, and as he kept doing it, next thing you know, they started walking over it. Before you know it, there was 50 cows lined up on the fence with my dad mooing at them. and you know, all these events I remember happening while we waited. And those are the things that I remembered most. And as I started to think back about my life, it's not the day-to-day things that we do on a consistent basis. You know, we wake up and we take a shower and we go to work or we go to school and we come home and we eat dinner. And those days can get they can become monotonous, right? We don't really remember those things, but what we do remember is when things go wrong. That's when memories are made, and that's when it becomes an adventure, right? So I started teaching my kids this principle, and you know, we'd be in the grocery store, and one of my kids would start to melt down, and one of my typical boys would say, "Hey Dad, now it's an adventure, right?" And he would smile, and I would smile too, and we'd say, "Let's just handle it," right? And so we would take difficult moments or things that we were outside the norm and realize that at some point we'd be able to look back on those things as memories that were outside of our normal day-to-day activities. I'll share with you one that really stands out to me, and I didn't really know this was happening at the time until years later. But one year, we live now in Boise, Idaho, and my wife had reserved an Airbnb down in Utah, and we're from Texas, obviously. And so my wife's mom and dad and my wife's brother and sister-in-law and their kids all came up in Medicine, Utah. So we drove down about 5 hours to Utah. They flew up, and we stayed in this Airbnb for a week. And it was just a lot of fun. We did a lot of things. But what I remember the most was when we were driving home from Utah. As we were coming home, traffic came to a standstill. And that between Utah and Boise is not really a heavily traveled freeway, so it becoming standstill was surprising. So everybody was basically stopped, and we found out that there was a wreck a couple miles ahead of us, and it was going to be hours. We were going to sit there for hours. Well, my more severe son on the autism spectrum started to get impatient and ramp up, and we could tell what was going to happen. And so my other son pulled out his phone, and we realized if we got off the freeway and went back a little bit, we could take a detour through some back areas. Well, turns out these back areas were a military missile range. And so, but we didn't care, right? I figured if it's a military missile range, it's public land. If it's a military missile range and they're shooting missiles, they'll let us know, right? They won't shoot us while we're on the... So anyway, we start driving, and it's dirt roads, and we're in a Toyota Sequoia fully loaded with, you know, there was 7 of us in the car at the time, with packed up and all this kind of stuff. And we're going up and down through these little things, and we start seeing holes in the ground. And my wife is like, "Kyle, I don't think this is a great idea." And I'm like, you know what? If they were going to shoot stuff, there'd be signs, right? It can't be that bad. And then we saw some tanks that looked like they were blown up. And my wife looked at me, and I said, you know, hey, we're already halfway there. And my son was tracking it on his iPhone at this time. Zach, my number 2 son. And as we kept going, eventually, we did see signs, but by then it was too late. We were almost out. And about the time we got out of the missile range and started driving on a regular road, we heard a big thump, 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 and we realized we had a flat tire. So that's when my number 2 son Zach said, you know what? It's just a trip until something goes wrong. Right, Dad? Now it's an adventure. And I said, you know what? Let's pull over, Zach. Let's see how fast we can change this tire. And let's do a world record for speed for changing this tire. So we pulled over and had to unpack and change the tire. And you know, it just became, we made it fun, even though it wasn't fun, and it took us what should have been about an hour and a half, 2-hour drive from where the accident was, turned into 6, 7, 8 hours of just adventure, right? And so I really didn't think much about it until a few years later when my daughter, who was little bitty at the time, she was probably 3 or 4, she was asked to share an experience, and she shared that experience and talked about how life is just kind of boring sometimes. And she was older at this time. She might have been 12 or 13 or so. And how we can take those moments and make them memories, and how much she remembered that moment. So the challenge that I'm going to share with you is this. The next thing something goes wrong, we've got an opportunity to address it and say, you know, it's just monotony until something goes wrong, and then we're challenged. And that's really where we can start to create memories in our lives. And that really is where our life becomes an adventure. And that really is the moments where that we will remember. The cool thing about it is, even those bad or difficult times, if we address them in the right spirit, we can turn them into good memories. And when we look back and we tell people these stories, we smile, just like I am right now. So that's my message for today. Hopefully that's helpful. You guys have a great day. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.